Today we're here at the temple ruins in Jerusalem. You can hear the sounds of the city, and what's right here are the ruins of the temple. Now let me explain something. This would probably have been the foundation of the temple, what you're seeing, because the temple itself, since it was made from limestone and moisture gets into limestone, when the fire was set that destroyed the temple, the stones actually exploded. And we'll talk about in just a minute why we're here, because today we're going to talk about the most important king, King Jesus. But first, let's pick up where we left off in the homework from last week. King Josiah, one of the best earthly kings, because he brought the word of the Lord to the people, but even he could not turn their hearts back to God. He was killed in a battle against the Pharaoh of Egypt, and after King Josiah's death, a few of his sons took over rulership. But honestly, they just served under the authority of the pagan nations of Egypt and Babylon. But don't forget, Israel is a divided nation. Hundreds of years later, Jesus would give nod to the dangers of a divided kingdom, a divided house. Matthew 12:25, knowing their thoughts, he said to them, "Every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and no city or house divided against itself will stand." In fact, the final end of the divided kingdom is the tragic reality of the temple being destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. When Babylon defeats Israel, and just like we read from Isaiah's prophecy to Hezekiah last week, all of the Israelites go into exile under the Babylonians at this point. And from this moment on, Israel is no longer referred to as the northern and southern kingdom. In tragic irony, it's this exile that unites them as one people, a family of God once more. There's no more divided kingdom. There is now an exiled community of Israelites desperately in need of a king that they can trust to rescue him, a Messiah, Jesus. As we look back on all that the people went through, it almost feels like these hardships they brought upon themselves were completely unnecessary. But God used even this to open up their eyes to the necessity of a divine rescue through Jesus. All right, there's another thing I want us to look at here in this last week of our study. Remember, we're at the temple ruins, so let's do a quick history of the temple. You'll see dates at the bottom of the screen for some of the events that took place, but here's what I want you to remember. When we're talking about the BC years from the biblical perspective, the numbers start large the farther away from the life of Jesus they are, and they get smaller counting towards the life of Jesus. Then, after Jesus, the numbers count forward in progression as we experience today. So, at the filming of this study today, we're in AD 2019. Regardless, the turning of the years from BC to AD happens with the life and death of Jesus. Now that we've cleared that up, let's look at the timeline for the first and second temple and why it's all in ruins today. King David collected the materials for the first temple built by human hands. King Solomon built the first temple. Then Israel is defeated by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, and the first temple is destroyed. King of Persia, Cyrus the Great, gets a revelation from God. We can read about this in the book of Ezra, chapter 1, verse 2. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah." You know, I have to stop here with the timeline and just say, isn't it shocking, but absolutely comforting to know that a king, King Cyrus of Persia, seemingly opposed to, or at least definitely not submitted to the authority of God, could not only hear from God, but was compelled to obey him? This should give us such great comfort today as we wrestle through the politics of our day and realize the validity of Romans 13:1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. No human authority is over God's authority, ever. No human king could ever do what God could ultimately do. So King Cyrus issued a decree for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem and allows Zerubbabel to begin the temple reconstruction as we see in Ezra 2:2-3. The foundation of the second temple is laid. A few years later, it's finished and dedicated by Zerubbabel. Ezra is then allowed to return to Jerusalem and teach the people the law of God, as seen in Ezra 7. Then, years later, Nehemiah, grieved by all the disrepair, comes and gets permission to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. When we read in the Gospels about Jesus and the disciples going up to the temple, it was the second temple. But remember what Jesus prophesied in Mark 13, 1 through 2. And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Around 70 AD, the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans happened, and the children of Israel were without a central place of worship. And as you can see from what's behind me, after the second destruction, the temple was never rebuilt. Why? Well, one of the reasons is because since its destruction, the city has been under foreign occupation. So the Israelites were not able to do as they pleased with the temple. Also, remember from a Christian perspective, one of the purposes of the temple was for it to be a place of sacrifice for sin. So when Jesus became the ultimate sacrifice, the practice of sacrifices no longer continued. Because of his shed blood, we can now enter into the Holy of Holies as we commune directly with God. Our bodies are now the temple. Now, under the new covenant, the very Spirit of God resides in us. 1 Corinthians 6:19, "Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own." This was the result of the era of the kings, these ruins. And what we really have to understand is that the people wanted the kings, and this is how it ultimately ended: a destroyed temple, a divided kingdom, a displaced people. Now, our tendency might be to mourn that the actions of the people could do something like this, but an often overlooked reality and something important for us to consider is, why was the temple needed in the first place? Remember, the temple was the place where relationship between God and his people took place. However, our relationship with God was never intended to primarily take place in the context of a physical building with a need for a priest to mediate. God always wanted a direct and personal relationship with his people. So let's take a look at where this originated and where it was actually possible: the Garden of Eden. You guys know I really, really love the Garden of Eden. And it's interesting because the Garden of Eden was really the very original temple. It was a temple garden. In the Garden of Eden, sometimes referred to as scholars as the temple garden, before the fall, there was no sin. There was direct access to the presence of God, and there was direct communion between man and God. Not only does this describe the Garden of Eden, but it also describes the way the Holy of Holies within the temple would have worked. However, in the days of the temple, only the high priest had access. The common man could not go to God directly. In comparison to the broken and inadequate way the priests communicated with God in the physical temple, Adam and Eve, without any hindrance or interference in their relationship with God, operated in the capacity of a high priestly role in the temple garden because they walked with God and they talked with God. The fall in Genesis 3 changed everything. The purpose of God was disrupted by the pride and arrogance of humanity. However, after Genesis 3, God was purposed in his resolve to bring humanity back into the temple garden. The ruins of this temple where we stand serve as such a reminder. It was never intended to be the final solution to experience true restoration of relationship. Through Christ, the Spirit of God now indwells the believer. Therefore, our very bodies have become a living temple. So now we can understand the original temple garden, the physical temple that Solomon built and Cyrus made way to be restored, and the temple ruins. And now, because of Jesus, us being the temple where the Spirit of God resides. You know, throughout all we've studied, we can trust God because we know the end of the story. The ruins that we see here on earth do not have the final say. And if I really believe that, I will live differently. I will think differently. I'll be able to stop kicking into self-protection mode and trying to control events, circumstances, and people. And I'll just be able to more fully trust God. You see, I fear the ruins here on earth. I fear things not turning out like I expected. I fear change. I really fear getting caught off guard. I fear things falling apart all around me and me not being able to stop it or fix it or change it and repair it. And that's why it's really good for me to stand here. And honestly, it's why I wanted you to see this place too. These ruins are directly across from the Mount of Olives. They're always facing the place where Jesus, our King, will return to reign. The earthly ruins will end and all things will be made new. And this gives me such courage to face the broken down places of my life with such greater assurance. I can trust our trustworthy King. I cannot trust solutions of my own making. Remember how we started out this study? The people looked around at all the other nations around them and they devised a solution of their own making. They decided that they wanted an earthly king and it led to ruins. All these earthly kings that we've talked about led to these ruins. Oh God, let this be a picture. Let these ruins burn into my brain so I quit trusting the wrong things. I trust you, God. Now I turn this question to you, friend. Could you have a marked moment today in the midst of these ruins and proclaim, God, when I try to take control, it will lead to ruins. But if I keep trusting you, it will lead to complete redemption. All the words in Scripture point to this. God is trustworthy and true. So let's end our time together with the hope of Revelation 21, 1 through 5. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And he who is seated on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. Also he said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true.